Hi, we're back, and our next guest is a very good friend of mine, old friend of mine from way back, an alumni of Seneca High School in Louisville, Kentucky. Also, the president of the Museum of Science in Boston, Tim Ritchie. Tim, I really appreciate you joining us, man. And you're one of the voices I think people need to hear more from. And so this is me trying to make that happen. And
Well, thank you.
here's the question I have for you: How has the new administration affected your ability and the ability of people in science? You're in Boston, like you said, at the epicenter of the greatest fight going on now between the president and Harvard. How is this affecting science?
Well, right now it's affecting it just because of uncertainty and fear. The long-term consequences could be giant if things don't change. And I think it's time for the public to understand what's at stake. You know, what science needs to thrive is the ability to pursue the truth. I mean, essentially, that's it.
Yeah.
And there are various components of that, one of which is to have institutions, most importantly, the government, that thinks that's a high value, that doesn't put ideology in front of evidence. When you put ideology in front of evidence, which is to a certain extent what's happening right now with this president, both in the attack on academic freedom, but also in the attack on science, bad things happen. So that's kind of number one. And I could come back to that with some
Yeah.
examples of what happens. Second thing, though, is not only the ability to pursue the truth in terms of the support for that as a value, but patient funding for it. So, for instance, in public health, there's no giant market that's going to be out there to help us produce new vaccines or to produce resistance to, microbial resistance and that sort of thing. The government has to support that if we're going to have a community that has a vibrant health in the future, or climate, or whatever. So patient funding for the things we need to build a better community with 8 billion people on the planet. We need to have public trust. That is being eroded, I think, every day. Public trust in science is really important. So how does the public think about AI? How does the public think about climate? How does the public, and all of that, I think, comes.
Vaccines. How does the public think about
Vaccines, right.
vaccines?
Vaccines, or even like health issues. I saw today that someone resigned from the FDA because his science wasn't pure enough for the FDA, and so it was censored. And then, of course, it has to have a strong educational system at the elementary, middle school, and high school level, not to mention high quality. And then finally, it has to have ethics. If any of these things are kind of missing, we're not going to have what science needs to thrive.
And so the argument is, of course, that it never has had that. It's tilted to the left, and you people don't really understand. And so, by God, let's go take vitamin E and that, or vitamin A, and that'll take care of the measles. Um, that aside, the thing about science, and I always say that journalism is just the scientific method applied to communication.
Yeah.
And that's about the only way I can look at what I do. The application of test theory and finding facts that way and the truth. So, what do we lose? What do we lose when we lose science? What is the greatest threat? You talked about the greater threat. What is the largest threat that we are facing, and how far away is that?
Well, there are many. Of course, climate change is probably the very biggest one. So if humanity doesn't rise up and use technology in creative ways to live sustainably on Earth, then the species will be in trouble. But there are plenty of others. I mentioned antimicrobial resistance, for instance. By 2050, if we don't develop new antibiotics or figure out how, more people will die because of antimicrobial resistance than die of cancer.
That's
And, and
frightening.
yeah, and there's no funding for that right now because as we think about discontinuing our support of science from a public standpoint, there's no mechanism to support that. That's just two. Let me think of another one. As we think about generational poverty, I mean, there are 8 billion people in the world, and most of them are poor. They will rise up and cause tremendous economic and civil instability if they don't have the means to prosper. And prospering has to do with education, it has to do with science. So dealing with the issue of generational poverty is going to be all about the application of science and technology to the problems we face. I could keep going. So,
Well, let me ask you this. Let me end with this. What if you had Donald Trump sitting in front of you right now, and I've had that fortune or misfortune, depending on how you go about it, thinking about it. If you had him in front of you right now, what is, as succinctly as you can put it, what would you tell the man?
well, it wouldn't start with science. It would start with his attitude toward other countries. And I would say, humanity, we need each other in order to survive. So this 19th century vision of us against the world will actually ruin the species. So first of all, undo all these tariffs and help us become a global community again, which I think he would probably reject. But the second thing is support science so that we can greet reality as a friend rather than run from it based on our ideology based on fear. Because if we can't treat reality as a friend, we are doomed to fail. So supporting science would be important, and also supporting the global nature of what we have to do to thrive might be first.
Well, thank